you so much. And yeah, gotta have the staged backdrop. That's a prerequisite these days. We're all figuring out the Zoom stuff. But thanks so much for having me, and thanks everyone for tuning in this evening and choosing to spend part of your evening listening to me. I thought that I'd just start off by talking a little bit about some of the behind the reporting and how I got into this story and how it was that I ended up spending more than 8 years writing about black lung in the first place. So, I was at the time, this really all started back in 2011, which I was a cub reporter at a nonprofit investigative news outlet called the Center for Public Integrity, which is based here in Washington, D.C., where I'm coming to you from this evening. And I was on a team that worked primarily on labor, environment, health, public health issues. And we had gotten an advance copy of a report by the governor's task force of West Virginia that had been an investigation into the worst coal mine disaster in 40 years, which was the Upper Big Branch mine disaster that was in southern West Virginia. It killed 29 miners. Some people may recall that. Massey Energy was the company. The larger-than-life coal baron CEO was Don Blankenship, who has since reappeared as a political candidate in the last couple of cycles. But anyways, we knew that we had gotten an advance copy and we were going to do a story based on this report, but we knew that other news outlets had also gotten an advance copy, and we were trying to figure out if there was something we could do that would be different, that would differentiate our story from the others. And it turned out that we ended up focusing on one page from the report, which had a surprising finding, which it was kind of, as a sidebar, said that there were, of the 29 miners, they had been able to do autopsies on 24 of them and look at their lungs. And of those 24, 17 had signs of black lung. Some of them were quite young, had not spent a lot of time in the mines. And that was surprising to me. I personally thought that black lung was something that surely must have been eradicated years ago. But what I learned at that time actually was that, in fact, the reverse. Government researchers from this division at the CDC had been documenting since around 2005 a resurgence of the disease. And in fact, levels today that they're documenting of the severe form of the disease are at the highest levels ever recorded in Central Appalachia. And that is more than even in the 1970s, just after the law was enacted that was meant to eradicate this disease, basically. And so that was obviously a very puzzling state of affairs for me. And it turned out that there was a reporter at NPR who had been doing a lot of reporting on coal and Upper Big Branch as well, the great Howard Burkus. He's now retired, but he had the same question, and he and producer Sandra Bartlett and I teamed up, and we went to the coal fields and went to southern West Virginia, southwestern Virginia, eastern Kentucky, spent time trying to answer the question of what's going on here? Why is black lung coming back? So we got to spend a lot of time with the government researchers, and also just really the best part was hanging out at a fire station or a Walmart parking lot or something in the coal fields, getting to meet miners as they were coming up for free screening for the disease. But ultimately, we sort of, there's a few reasons why it appears that the disease is resurging. And one is that the miners are working longer hours. Another is that there is a more toxic possible mixture of dust, that because of the economics of the coal industry, there's more cutting of rock above and below the coal seams, and that unleashes a type of dust that can be particularly toxic. And then the third point is that for years, there has been an open secret basically in the coal industry that fraud is rampant, and that there are loopholes that you could drive a truck through that companies have taken advantage of to basically make it appear to regulators that they are complying with the limits on the dust that they are required to control in the mines, but they're not actually doing so. So what miners are actually breathing way more dust than is safe. And it's a very simple equation: more dust, more severe disease. So it was while we were spending time with a lot of these guys in a clinic in southern West Virginia, and there's a legendary doctor who has since passed. His name is Don Rasmussen, and he had really been a pioneering figure in winning recognition of this disease, because, believe it or not, until the 1969 Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act, there was still some debate in this country about whether black lung was a real disease that was disabling and whether people were deserving of compensation. That act changed that, and we made two promises in there. Through Congress, we, the American people, said we're going to virtually eradicate this disease. We know how to do it. You control the amount of dust in the mine air. And there are ways to do that involving ventilation and just some pretty basic things you can do. And then two, that until that day comes, we're going to provide fair compensation. Now, this is modest monthly payments and medical coverage for medical treatment related to lung disease. And we're going to provide that to miners who get sick in the meantime. We have not completely delivered on that promise 50 years later. And that is really what this book is about. But the book is about that large story, but it's also a very intimate story of two men. And it was really, I met the first of them at one of these clinics when I was first in southern West Virginia in 2012. And his name is John Klein. And he was a lawyer at the time. And I had heard a lot of complaints about the black lung benefits system and how unfair it was, and how miners were losing even though they had obvious cases of disease. And I was somewhat wary of trying to wade into that because I wasn't sure that I would be able to uncover anything new or say anything productive about the benefit system, other than it seems to be unfair and miners lose a lot. But it was when John told me about a man whose case he'd handled, and that was a coal miner named Gary Fox, and he's the other primary character in the book. And Gary was born in an old coal camp in southern West Virginia. His father was a coal miner who died of lung disease. Often at the time, they just misdiagnosed it as tuberculosis, but the brothers suspected it had a lot to do with that it was likely actually black lung. But he died when Gary was a boy, leaving Gary's mother to raise 4 boys on her own. She cleaned homes for people in the area and managed to make do. And when Gary ultimately ended up serving in Vietnam, coming back and driving a truck. And then, like so many people, he got married, and he had a child, and he wanted to provide for them. And so he went into the mines of southern West Virginia. And I'd like to just briefly read a little bit about what every day was like for Gary. And he would work, the routine was usually 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week, sometimes more, and long commutes. And so he would have these full days, and then afterwards, this is what he would do. So finally, after at least 9 hours underground and 3 hours on the road, Gary would pass from rural terrain into the commercial landscape of small town America. All-night diners and fast food joints, chain hotels and grocery stores, then into planned communities and cul-de-sacs, and finally home. Inside the 2-story house, he would peel off his clothes and place them in a pile from separate from the rest of the laundry. Once a week, his wife, Mary, took them to a laundromat. She didn't want the coal dust clogging up their home washing machine. In the shower, he tried to scrub off the finely ground coal dust that had found its way into nearly every cranny and crevice of his body. He had a brush for the dust embedded under his fingernails. In front of a mirror, he pulled the skin below one eye and, with a towel, wiped away the coal dust that had collected at the lash line. He did the same thing for the top lid, then repeated the process on the other eye. Some men didn't bother with these thin black rings the folks in the coal fields called miner's mascara, maybe out of laziness, maybe just out of pride. But Gary wouldn't have it. Mining was his job, not his life. Many men were brimming with stories of underground exploits, and in their spare time, they grabbed beers with work buddies. Not Gary. When he was underground, he was all business, but he refused to bring the job home. It wasn't that he didn't like the work, he just had more important things to do than rehash the day's labors. Whatever spare time he did have was spent with Mary and their adolescent daughter, Terry. He wasn't going to waste that time carrying on about the mines, and he certainly wasn't going to go out to eat with them, looking like he was wearing makeup. From the medicine cabinet, Gary grabbed pills to loosen the joints in his arthritic hands. His body ached from a lifetime of wounds. While serving in Vietnam, he'd been in a truck accident and sheet metal had shattered his foot. Falling rock in a mine had crushed his shoulder. His hands locked up from years of drilling metal bolts through layers of sandstone and shale. 6 days a week, sometimes 7, Gary repeated these rituals in a meticulous attempt to scrub his world of coal dust. But over the years, it had seeped inside him, lodged itself there so deeply that there was no scrubbing it away. It was amassing in his lungs, and each day underground added to that load little by little. Gradually, these fine black specks would stain and scar what they touched. Specks would reach towards other specks until they coalesced and turned chunks of tissue into useless black masses. But Gary was focused on what came with the dust, the best paycheck and health insurance around. In southern West Virginia, the clearest path to earning a good living had long been coal mining. It was coal mining that would allow him to provide the kind of life he had in mind for Mary and Terry. His own childhood spurred him on. Mary, unlike his mother, would not have to work or worry about scraping together the next meal. Terry would go to college, something no one in his family had had the chance to do. He'd sworn to himself that when he had a family of his own, he'd seal them off from a world of worry, want, and black dust. So every day he returned to that world himself. Gary's story was like so many of the miners that I would come to meet and get to know in the years since. But what really stood out about Gary, and the reason that I decided to write about the benefits system when John Klein, the lawyer, told me about him, was because of the case that he and John were pursuing together at the time. And it was really an extremely consequential legal case. And Gary, after almost 30 years in the mines, had applied for black lung benefits. He had masses on his lungs that had been seen on x-ray, and his doctors were treating him for black lung. Yet he lost his benefits claim. And he, in his first benefits claim, had not been able to find a lawyer, which is the case with so many miners because of the disincentives that are baked into this system. And he had lost, and because his wife had a chronic illness and they couldn't go without health insurance, he went back to work in the mines, and he got very ill over the subsequent years, being exposed further to coal dust. It was only years later that he sort of, by a stroke of luck, met John Klein. And John helped him pursue another benefits claim, this time trying to figure out what had gone wrong in his first claim. And I'd like to just briefly read about John, if I could. John was a rarity. here in the coal fields. A lawyer who was willing to help miners navigate an abstruse legal system in pursuit of modest monthly payments and medical coverage as recompense for the disease that robbed their breath, the old scourge with the disturbingly accurate name black lung. Most lawyers wouldn't touch these cases. They were complex, time-consuming, and fiercely contested. Coal companies and their lawyers made sure of that. Success rates were low, and even after a win, a miner's lawyer had to prevail in yet another round of legal combat against the company to collect fees that barely kept the lights on. Yet this was the only type of case John took, the only type he'd ever wanted to take. It was why, a few years earlier, he'd gone to law school at age 53 and emerged with a load of student debt he would still be paying off long after others his age had retired. Law was his fourth vocation. The first three, community organizer, carpenter, and rural medical clinic staffer, might suggest the incongruous roving of a restless soul, but John saw each of these, as well as his current one, as variations of the same job, which he described as trying to be of use. Here in the house he'd built with his own hands in a small community on the outskirts of Beckley, the nearest thing to a big city southern West Virginia coal country had, he ran a solo practice. He had no assistants, no secretaries, no paralegals. Each case was John versus the coal company. His kitchen was the de facto meeting room. Directly overhead on the second floor was his office, a small space covered in manila folders bearing the names of sick miners or their widows, each file stuffed with legal and medical arcana, designed to befuddle and discourage those who couldn't find a lawyer like John. Spare shelf space held family photos, and on the wall hung a portrait of Mary Harris' mother, Jones, the labor activist and miner's angel who had adopted West Virginia as her second home. A famous quote of hers was inscribed beside her bespectacled face: "Pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living." So I got to know John pretty well over the last 8 years or so. John is the kind of person that you don't think exists in the real world sometimes. And it was, he is originally from upstate New York, and he had gone as a VISTA volunteer in 1968 to southern West Virginia, and was a community organizer, then stayed and had a construction company that he ran with his father that almost exclusively built homes for people of modest means who qualified for a government low-interest loan program. And then he went to work as a benefits counselor at a rural medical clinic where he would help miners go through the basic testing and then file the initial benefits claim that would get their federal process started. But people in his position weren't actually representing miners. That was crazy. You couldn't even get lawyers to do that. Nonetheless, he became fascinated by this system and started taking on cases for miners who came into the clinic as a lay representative. And it was during this time when he started to uncover what he believed was a pattern by the leading law firm that represents coal companies in so many of these cases of systematically withholding key evidence in cases over the years, causing miners to lose their claim. And that was ultimately what happened to Gary. And it was years later when John met Gary, and he and Gary were able to try and uncover the evidence that had been withheld in Gary's previous claim, causing him to lose and return to the mines where he became much sicker. And Gary, his employer, Massey Energy, had hired this law firm, sure enough, and they fought very hard. And that's really what this book is about. It's about Gary and John and the way that their fight for not only Gary's case, but to try and achieve a modicum of fairness in the system for other miners really epitomizes the way that we've as a country, failed to deliver on those two promises that I mentioned 50 years ago of a disease eradication and fair compensation. And so that led me to look into this system. And so I spent quite a bit of time, and I'm happy to describe the nitty-gritty of the reporting in a lot more detail. But ultimately, what I ended up doing was identifying cases of interest and looking into them more deeply. These are minors' benefits claims. It was pretty difficult to do because these are not public court records. These are privacy-protected administrative proceedings. And so the only way to look at the case files was to figure out the cases of interest, contact the minors and their family members, and ask if they would allow me to view their case files. And so I ended up taking all these forms down to the Labor Department and getting all of these boxes and boxes of documents that are still living in my apartment here, and logging them over months, and ended up finding that basically John was correct, that there was a pattern by this law firm of withholding evidence. That also led me to look into doctors who were prominent in the system, and it's not necessarily all that surprising that you would have the usual suspects who frequently testify in these cases. But what I hadn't expected to find was that in almost every case, it felt like, for the coal company, there were X-ray and CT scan readings by really just one prominent doctor who was prolific at Johns Hopkins and a few of his colleagues. And they had a really outsized impact on thousands of cases over the years because judges deferred to their credentials in a lot of cases, and found that the minors did not have black lung. So I ended up creating a record of what his record actually was, and then figuring out that ultimately a lot of his views, it turned out, were at odds with the medical literature and the consensus opinions of basically a lot of prominent radiologists and contemporary standards. So this was that ultimately led to a series that I did for the Center for Public Integrity in 2013. But it was really because the legal fight that Gary and John were waging was ongoing, and because I really wanted to tell their stories, I felt an obligation almost to keep going. So in 2014, I committed to doing a book on this, and that's what I've been working on since. And it has really been an incredible, a book is a learning process, and it's been a ton of work that this is my first book, and so I guess we'll see if I have the stomach to do another one at any point. But really having an excuse to go back to West Virginia over and over again and spend time with these people and get to know minors and their families and follow them through their struggles. And what was the best part was that it wasn't just following them through hardships. It was also being there for the triumphs, the rare victories. And that was what was really inspiring to me, both in a lot of the other minors that I ended up writing about in the book, and also especially in the case of Gary and John, how their persistence really led to remarkable legal reforms of the sort that I have rarely seen. And it was just an incredible privilege to be part of that, to witness that, to document it, and to now share it in this book. So I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. So please fire away.
Wonderful. I am fascinated with this story, and find that the two people that you elevated, of course, John Klein and Gary Fox, you've got this, there's the classic kind of David and Goliath there, but it really does take someone who's got the time to unearth the documents. I mean, it's really a story to me of getting that evidence. And I'm so glad that I'm fascinated by what it took to get that evidence. My first question for you is, when you first were going to the hospital to kind of see what, kind of get a feel, it sounds like, for the story, what was it like to be, a lot of people don't like hospitals, and it's a little disturbing, I imagine, to kind of try to figure out as a journalist how to approach people maybe when they're not well or being treated for things. So how did you decide to approach it, or to whom did you turn for advice on how to do that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think that's my experience. If a journalist came up to me, if I was in the medical clinic or a hospital getting some sort of procedure done, I would say, "What are you doing? Get the hell away from me." But that was actually not what happened for the most part in these cases, which was incredible. I loved kind of just hanging around at these clinics, and I was amazed at how open people were and welcoming. And I mean, one of the first reporting trips that I took back in 2012, as I was mentioning, spending time at Dr. Rasmussen's clinic, and I was just, I just kind of showed up in the waiting room. I mean, we'd obviously told Dr. Rasmussen that we were coming, and we had an interview with him, but he said, you can try and, I mean, if these guys want to talk to you, have at it. But, we were just sitting around in the waiting room and striking up conversations with these guys. And they said, "Oh yeah, come on, follow me through the process." So we went through the whole process. They take off their shirt. They've got the catheter in their arm. They've got all the sticky pads stuck to their body while they're exercising. And they've got, this huge headpiece on for the testing. And they're just, shooting the breeze with me and talking about mining and all kinds of that stuff. And, the guy that I went through the test with there ended up inviting me to his family reunion that year in Eastern Kentucky. So I went and hung out with their family there at a park in Eastern Kentucky, and, talked with his three brothers, all of whom had black lung, and his father, who had black lung. And it was, it was fun. It was also a harrowing thing to hear a lot of what they'd been through. But, that was what I found over and over again, that people were just grateful that someone cared, that someone was trying to tell their stories. And so it was a pleasure to do that.
So when you were learning more about black lung, and I think you're right, for a lot of people, the whole idea of coal mining has an almost, let's say, 1700s, 1800s element to it. But, your research and your book and your work really fits in so nicely with, of course, I was immediately reminded of Barbara Koppel's documentary, Harlan County, USA, that's in Kentucky, and that was 1976. And so there's a lot to, it's not far away. It's really not, it's a present issue. What was that experience like for you to get to understand an industry that's so old, but still operating today?
Yeah, it is one of those, it's a place where, if you go and spend time in parts of Eastern Kentucky or Southern West Virginia or Southwestern Virginia, it just feels like you just have a sense of this weight of history and this deep cultural, it's just difficult to describe. And there's all these really beautiful and then horrible things that are bound up with that at the same time. hard work and a lot of beautiful music and great things that have come out. But then you've got, these denuded landscapes where it's all been stripped by, mountaintop removal mining. You've got exploitation and of the people and poverty. And it's, in some ways it feels like history is ongoing there. And so that was one thing that I really tried to do with the book, was I wanted to tell a lot of this history because, it's just fascinating, honestly. I mean, a lot of what's happened there, but I didn't want this to feel like a historical book. So I had to try to weave that in. But I think really I tried to integrate the fight that people like John and Gary are having, have had in recent years, and the fights that are ongoing today, and situate those within the historical context. And really, in a lot of ways, it's the same fight that was being fought 150 years ago. And they're still pursuing this sense of a semblance of justice today. So it's really a continuing thread. And that was, what I hope I've portrayed in the book.
I think even the cover of your book, a photograph and a book cover are so important, but a great black and white photograph that captures that to my mind anyway, the beauty, but I don't know, there's something disturbing. There's a kind of a melancholy that I think is really so important in looking at that story. I have to do a little shout out to Mother Jones because you mentioned her. I was on a road trip with my partner a few years ago, and there's a road sign that said Mother Jones burial. And I found where she's buried, and I wrote it down because I wanted to get this right. She was buried in Mount Olive, Illinois, and it was at the Union Miners Cemetery. So she requested to be buried with some miners. So we went in there, we found where she was buried. And I love that quote that you mentioned of hers, because I really associate her with this struggle, and I really place your book there too. I think it's a part of that continuum. So I'm so glad that, shout out to Mother Jones. Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it was interesting, a little piece of history is that her actual connection with the law firm that I write about in the book, there is a historical connection there, in that back in the early 20th century, the mine wars, basically over the fight over unionization in trying to establish the United Mine Workers Union in southern West Virginia, which was fought pretty heavily by companies and at the time, but the law firm actually hired a stenographer to shadow Mother Jones to try and gather information that could be used to try and present to the authorities that she was inciting violence. It didn't end up working, but it just kind of shows how this law firm has really, it's the same law firm that Gary and John are battling over withheld evidence in recent years. So it's that same thread of history throughout Appalachia that just it kind of is a constant there,
There is a constant struggle, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, because your continuity and change, but even as those hidden practices, I think, and I that you talked about, where this supposedly miners were better protected from getting black lung, but it sounds like to me it was an open secret that there was still going to be more dust in the air, and to me that is a sort of skirting of the good faith promise to take care of these men.
I mean, the thing is that we know what we need to do to prevent this disease. I mean, you control the dust, basically. And there's certain things, I mean, it's, you keep the air flowing through the mine, but one way you do that is you hang curtains and you build stoppings and you mine in a certain order. These are all things that are pretty basic mining practices. The problem is that it takes time to do those things, and when you're doing those things, you aren't mining coal. And that has always been the tension, is that is sort of been called dead time, or time that you're not really earning money for the company. And there's always been a tremendous amount of pressure to scrimp on that. And companies have sort of incorrectly inculcated this belief in miners that black lung is inevitable, that if you mine, there will be some amount of dust and there will be some black lung, and there's just no way to prevent that. But that's just not true. And I think, talking with a lot of miners who spent their whole career, they've expressed to me sort of this tangled of emotions that is very difficult for them to reconcile, which is that they knew that what they were being pressured to do was probably illegal and could harm them, but they didn't feel like they had a lot of choice. And now they regret it and feel guilty about it, but it wasn't really a choice that they were presented with. It was do this or lose your job in so many cases. So they ended up sick and then blaming themselves to some degree for it, which is really tragic. And in 2014, there was a regulation that at long last was put in place that should close some of these loopholes and cut down on the cheating. And so, I do have hope that maybe years from now, we will see the effects of that showing up in a future generation of miners not suffering that same fate. But a lot of it does depend on what we do going forward in terms of, whether we actually enforce the law. So much to be determined.
Is there a lot of pressure? Did you pick up on any miners who didn't want to speak to you? Felt like this kind of reporting that you were a part of, you or others, was a threat, or that they had really sided with the industry, and that it's not just a kind of a black and white, all miners on one side, the big industry on the other? Was there any of that tension as well?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of times the rhetoric, and a lot of the political rhetoric especially, sort of conflates the interests of the coal industry with coal miners individually. And those are often aligned, but not always aligned. And, this was one of those instances where there absolutely was that tension. It is very difficult in a lot of cases to get miners who are still working to talk to you about this stuff, at least on the record, because they're very afraid that they will lose their jobs, and that this is really the best, in some cases, only really, viable job that's available to a lot of these people. And you can absolutely understand why they would act in a way why they would support their employers, and why they would vote for people who they perceive, rightly or wrongly, as furthering the interests of those employers, and not wanting to do anything, including talking to a reporter like me, that could potentially endanger their jobs, or whether that's the company firing them for direct action, or something that just causes the company to have to lay off a bunch of people and everyone's out of a job. I mean, people are very sensitive to this sort of boom and bust cycle. So, it was a little frustrating that sometimes, it was hard to get people to talk who were still working, but I completely understand it, and I don't really blame them.
Well, we have some questions, and something that sort of touches on nicely with what you just said. This is a question from Debbie. What other economic opportunities, if any, are available for these miners? Any other developments that could offer better jobs for them?
That is a perfect question, and that's a question that I ask people a lot, that I ask of policymakers who are a lot smarter than me, and I hope that someone figures out the answers to that question. Because in a lot of cases, you know, at least based on the reporting that I was doing, there really is the perception and perhaps the reality. It's difficult for me to independently know for sure, but you spend time there, it sure doesn't seem like there's a lot of other economic opportunities for a lot of people who live in these areas. And this really is by far the best paying job with the best benefits. Obviously, we need to think pretty seriously about the future because, you know, put aside any sort of environmental regulations, I mean, just market forces are going to, I mean, I think we're seeing sort of inevitably driving coal to be less and less a piece of the energy portfolio for this country. And so, you know, I mean, it's not going to get any easier for these communities. And I think, you know, I don't have any great answers. I mean, you see these one-off things about, you know, let's teach them the software coding or something like that. I mean, that's great. It's kind of gimmicky and it's a one-off. You know, I don't know. I think there's a real need to have sustained investment in these communities and a serious conversation about what their future looks like. And I wish I knew what that was.
I think for a lot of people who don't have coal mining as a part of their family, or people who don't live in those areas of Appalachia, for example, where there's so few jobs, but that's a great paying job with benefits comparatively, and there's a history and people don't want to move or they can't move. I think on the outside looking in, it seems to be one of the recurrent questions: what to do, how to change it. And that's a big structural economic question, but it's also a deeply personal question too, I think. There's another question, and this is from Hope. Hope asks, what were the miners' thoughts on environmental impact? And what thoughts did they share with you about what was happening?
So I generally tried to avoid talking too much about politics and about the specific environmental implications of coal, and keep most of the conversations with miners about what the actual mining process was like and then their health and things like that. But I mean, I think it's difficult to say, but miners are not, it's not like they don't care about the environment. It's just that it's a real tension. And I mean, I think, you know, I mean, guys are sad when they see, you know, they don't like seeing a mountain stripped off either, but you know, it's that stripped off mountain means work for them potentially. So I mean, yeah, we really didn't talk about it a lot, but it is this kind of real tension that's sort of difficult to navigate there.
Were you concerned by some things you saw that had to do with the condition of the environment? Any kind of anything that you thought, that doesn't look too good?
Well, I mean, I think you just drive around. Obviously, you see, and you see this beautiful region, and then you've just got, you know, it's completely stripped bare in some areas. But I mean, you know, you have slurry ponds that leach into the water supply. I mean, this is well documented. I mean, it has a serious effect. It's not just, you know, like we want to preserve an endangered fish or something. I mean, it's, you know, not that that's not meritorious in its own right, but these are things that are directly affecting the health of the people who live in these communities. You know, without the foliage there, with the mountains stripped bare, there's more intense flooding, and it just destroys their property. I mean, you've got contamination of the groundwater. I mean, you just, yeah, there are obviously a lot of well-documented problems that come along with mining coal.
We had an author event with Aaron Brockovich about water just a few weeks ago. And I think that the connection between industries like mining and contamination of the water is not really well understood, at least outside of. I think that industries like, well, nuclear power, if I were to look for analogies, I think of nuclear power as one of those, another industry where it's deeply politicized. And so for a journalist to find an entry point and not alienate people who you need their trust and know that you can tell their story. I think that's a big challenge. It seems like you navigated it well, though. I'm interested in why somebody like Gary Fox would go to law school in his 50s. What was he thinking?
John Klein, you mean?
No,
Yeah,
sorry.
John,
Sorry.
the other.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just got him confused.
Yeah, I mean, he was really, it was a situation where he felt like, lay representatives in these cases, you actually can't get fees. Even lawyers have to petition for modest legal fees that they don't get until after the fact in these benefits cases. And that's one of the reasons that it's such a deterrent for lawyers even entering this system at all. And it's delayed, and it's really meager amount that companies then fight you on that. Even they litigate for potentially years more about the attorney's fees after you've already won the case, after maybe anywhere from 2 to, I've seen cases that go on for 20 years. If you're going to represent these guys full time, you kind of have to be a lawyer, because lay representatives can't get fees. And so, but I think also John just wanted a little bit of, it was really when he went back to law school, and while he was doing some research in the library, that he came across this theory of fraud on the court, which is kind of a heightened type of fraud that he came to believe applied to this law firm's actions in withholding evidence. And it is not just sort of common variety, garden variety civil law fraud, but rather a scheme to subvert the entire functioning of the judicial system. And he ended up that becoming a critical point in his case that he pursued with Gary. And he argued that that was what the law firm had done in that case. So, reading case law in the law school library, you just never know. But yeah, I think that's another reason why John went back to law school. And he's been glad to have it, although he doesn't like to go by Esquire.
He's almost a Dickensian character. I'm feeling very Bleak House with this. And for the audience, bear with me that I just did a deep literary reference there, but I think Charles Dickens would appreciate something related to coal mining and the exploitation of the poor. So, but John Klein definitely reminds me of someone, not like a character like that. There was another question from Patricia. Do you see this situation improving at any point in the future? And is there a documentary you would recommend?
On the last point, yes, there is a documentary that I actually mentioned earlier, the work that I teamed up with Howard Burkus of NPR. He later teamed up with PBS Frontline, and they did a documentary called Coal's Deadly Dust. And it's about the resurgence of the disease and kind of they looked more deeply into why that's occurring and what might be able to address that. And then in terms of whether there's hope for the future, God, I really hope so. As I mentioned, I think things are probably a little bit, in terms of the economic viability of the coal industry, I'm not so sure. In terms of actually preventing disease, I think there are some indications that we may be making progress. While the levels of disease are at the highest that they've ever been recorded, the levels of severe disease today in Central Appalachia that is likely the result of exposures that occurred years ago. And so the actions that I mentioned, the regulations that were implemented in 2014, lower the dust limit a little bit, but the key point there is really that it cut down on cheating, potentially by closing the loopholes and also mandating the use of this new sampling device that is continuous. It's got a computer in it, rather than just collecting on a filter that you then mail into a lab. So it should be, in theory, harder to defraud that. And then there is an ongoing fight about one of the key issues really here that is driving the resurgence is this exposure, as I mentioned, to a more toxic mixture of dust that includes more rock. And there have been basically, I mean, the way that you would do that is to impose stricter limits and controls on the amount of that specific type of dust. It's called silica. It's like these fine crystals, you know, quartz. And there have been there's been a real effort to get this administration to act on that and to implement a separate rule for silica that was just getting underway under the previous administration and has kind of stalled somewhat. There's a similar rule that got passed by OSHA, but it doesn't apply to mines. And so the administration has put out a request for information and it's solicited feedback on this, but so far it hasn't actually proceeded to any sort of regulatory action on that. And I know that there are a lot of miners advocates who are very disappointed about that and really hope that that will change going forward.
Well, we're closing in at the top of the hour. So audience, just, if you've got a few more minutes, I had two things that I had talked with Chris about. One is the image behind him, and he's got a little red item there too. Look at that, I love that. So Chris, could you take just a couple of moments to tell us about the visuals?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, this is just, you know, obviously spending a lot of time in coal country, you know, it has had an impact on me. This is the Norman Rockwell painting of a coal miner. This red thing right here is actually the power box. And then here you can see the headlamp. So this would be a miner's headlamp, and I picked that up at a thrift store in Beckley, West Virginia. But I've got you know, in my office, which I haven't been to since March, I guess. God, there's, you know, a lump of coal that I scooped up from the roadside. I mean, there's just, you know, all sorts of. It's just a very culturally rich region, and it's hard not to feel part of that. You know, and in terms of some music, you mentioned the documentary Harlan County, USA. The soundtrack to that is tremendous. Kathy Mattea's Coal album is really good. A new album from Steve Earle, Ghosts of West Virginia. The title of the book, actually, Soulful of Coal Dust, is drawn from a Hazel Dickens song. And Hazel Dickens was a legendary folk singer in Appalachia, and it's actually from the song titled Black Lung that she wrote for her brother who died of black lung. And there are numerous books that are really good, but one that I would, in particular, I've got Alan Derrickson is a labor history professor, Black Lung Anatomy of a Public Health Disaster. It's incredibly useful. And then Barbara Ellen Smith, Digging Our Own Graves. This is a tremendous one. And actually, in just a few weeks, she has updated that book with a new intro and some other materials that is going to be published in the coming weeks. And I would definitely recommend that to people.
You seem to have really been changed by this experience. Someone who's got who's found items in a thrift store, who's listening to the music, who's got the Norman Rockwell painting. It sounds immersive. Would you say that you've come out of this changed some ways?
I mean, absolutely. That's, you know, you have to enjoy something if you're going to work on it for, you're going to work on the book for 6 years. So it absolutely has been the most meaningful and rewarding experience of my career. And I just really feel lucky to have gotten to do all this and to have all these experiences and know these people and to tell this story and put it out there for the public.
Your book really is in the that body of labor history and investigative journalism that's so important to telling us about how we get how we consume products, how we get, every time we flick a switch on, where we're getting that energy and at what cost to people. So I want to thank you so much for your time this evening and sharing this story. I am really moved by John Klein and Gary Fox. How's Gary Fox doing, by the way?
Well, Gary actually, I mean, I don't think it's spoiling anything to say that he does not, he passed from the disease. And that has been the case, unfortunately, of a number of miners that I've gotten to know over the years. But John Klein is doing quite well, and he's still representing miners in his 70s, and I speak with him frequently. So,
well, what are you working on next?
Well, I don't have any plans for a new book anytime in the near future. This has cured me of that, at least temporarily, although the itch may arise again at some point. But, in my day job for the Times, I am working on a project related to the coronavirus and the government response to it, the federal response. So, it's an interesting time to be alive and to be a journalist, certainly.
Well, I thank you so much for bringing the story of John Klein and Gary Fox to readers. And I think the whole resurgence in the interest in Appalachia is spurred on by the work of journalists like yourself and documentarians and people who have made a commitment to find out about these people and how they do their work and at what cost, and what deep personal cost. So thank you so much again for your time, and thank you all audience members for tuning in this evening. We're here at Malaprops virtually. We would have loved to have had Chris in the store, but maybe you'll swing by once it's okay and healthy to do so. We would love to have you back, and I hope you get that itch to write another book, because this one was so great and so important that we've got to have more.
Well, thank you. And I do just want to mention briefly, happy birthday to my father today. And a week from today is my mother's birthday. So Roger and Elizabeth, they encouraged my writing from a very young age. They always read to me when I was every night as a child. And they have been so supportive throughout this book process. So happy birthday to both of them. I love you very much. Thank you. And thank you to Malaprops. This was really a lot of fun. And, I'd love to be there in person, maybe after all of the pandemic subsides someday. And thank you to everyone for tuning in.
Bring your folks, because we'll have a great time at Malaprops, and they certainly do play such a prominent role in your acknowledgments in your book. It was very moving. So I encourage everyone to check out Chris's book, Soulful of Coal Dust. We have it at Malaprops. So go to malaprops.com. Thank you, Chris, again. And for mentioning Mother Jones. I love to hear a great Mother Jones, name dropping. That's good. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and happy birthday, Chris's dad, and then later his mom. Celebrate safely. Good night.
Thank you.